And I'm lucky to be able to Skype in with Jennifer Lawless down at American University, the director of the Women in Politics Institute down there, professor of government, and our ears and feet on the ground down in D.C. with everything that's going on in the Trump administration. So, Jennifer, thank you for being on today.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Well, you know, as it seems like every week, now this is week 2, we've had news coming out of D.C. and the Trump administration, and just want to pick your brain on a little bit. Today, Department of Homeland Security talking about new rules pertaining to basically the expulsion of undocumented immigrants. What's the talk down there with the rules that have come out from Homeland Security? Is it what people had anticipated that Trump had talked about all along, or things that that people weren't aware of and are of concern?
I think it's pretty consistent with his campaign trail message, but it also highlights the fact that the Trump administration is now well aware of the fact that they're not going to be able to just issue broad executive orders and have the courts support what they say. So when they actually do have control over writing these laws or writing these regulations and telling Homeland Security what to do, it's important for their agenda to be as stringent and as strict as they possibly can be, because that's going to be the more effective and efficient route for them to accomplish their immigration goals.
Do you think, you know, let's circle back to where the travel ban, how that had played out with the Trump administration. Obviously saw courts overrule that. He's going back to the drawing board with that. You know, is this airtight, what came out of Department of Homeland Security, or is it subject to scrutiny or further pushback?
Well, I mean, everything is subject to scrutiny and further pushback, but a broad sweeping executive order like we saw with the ban a couple of weeks ago is obviously going to garner more immediate reaction and attention than rules that just sort of lay out new plans for how to deal with deportations or immigration. And so my bet is that we're still going to see pushback, but it's going to probably be more like the kind of pushback that we're accustomed to when one party disagrees with the other party, and not so much where immediately we're going to see district level and federal appeals courts weigh in on an executive order.
Yes, and so some of the things that had come out from the new rules that had been released today, talking about, again, undocumented immigrants with criminal records previously that had been for serious crimes, and now we're looking at potentially any crime or even smaller crimes. Talk to me a little bit about that. Is there a little, how does that look?
Well, what the Obama administration had done was basically come up with a list of how important it was to deport somebody. And that was based on criminal history. It was based on violent crimes. It was based on a series of factors that sort of suggested that those people were threats to the United States. What the Trump administration has done is basically said, look, none of these categories matter anymore. Everybody who's here illegally is fair game for deportation, or is fair game for at least being considered. And what that does is it very seriously expands the list of people who might now feel like their status here is in jeopardy.
And one of the things I'd seen mentioned today, too, was to talk of putting more immigration and customs agents out. 10,000, is that the number being talked about? Was this expected to have this many more customs and immigration officials under the Trump administration?
So this is the number that I also saw today. It's tricky. You know, Donald Trump was a little bit unconventional in terms of his presidential campaign because, unlike most Republicans, he was not really focusing on smaller government. He was focusing on change and a different approach. And so ordinarily, if you heard a Republican president say that he was going to increase the number of immigration officials by 10,000, that would seem very strange. But it's not necessarily inconsistent with anything that Trump himself said on the campaign trail, which further highlights how different this administration really is from a typical Republican.
And how quickly, I mean, you're down there, you're in government, you know this, how quickly will we see 10,000 more immigration officials? Are we talking 3 months, 6 months? I mean, what is this going to look like? And what will we see here in Rhode Island? I mean, will we see an increased presence of immigration officials based off of that number, or will it be more focused on the border from what you've seen from reports?
I mean, from what I've seen down here and what I've seen at the from what I saw watching the press conference today, we have no idea how long this is going to take or how it will actually be implemented. And what I think Donald Trump has learned and realized over the course of the last month is that it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to actually do it. So this is not going to be a situation where tomorrow morning we all of a sudden have 10,000 more immigration officials and every airport looks different. My sense sense is that the places on the border that have a higher influx of immigration, as well as the large airports in major cities, will be the places where we initially see an increase. But again, it's unclear exactly what they're going to be doing or how they're going to be doing it in a way that's different from what's already happening. And that's going to be, where the rubber hits the road. Like, what are the details of this plan and how will it actually be executed?
And, I referenced before, we talked about the travel ban and the courts overturning it, and obviously he's going back to the drawing board to reintroduce something new. What's the talk down there? What do we expect from the Trump administration now that first bite of the apple was not successful by Trump? What's the talk? What do we expect?
From everything that I've heard down here, as well as from think tanks and public policy experts, we're expecting that the next executive order will meet legal approval simply because a second ban that is struck down by the courts would be a major defeat, because it would demonstrate not only that the administration didn't know what they were doing in the first place, but that when they were told that they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't learn from that mistake. So my sense is that it's still going to be far more overreaching than Democrats or independents or even some Republicans would like, but it will have less broad sweeping language that's seen as, completely overreaching, and we saw it the first time around.
And let's tack a little bit from that to, I did see that there was reports, and it was an AP story, for the potential prospect of a government shutdown. Now, they have to deal with the supplemental, and obviously part of that could be funding for his proposed wall along the Mexican border. And obviously with the balance of the Senate being what it is, could that actually be a prospect? Now, I think that the deadline date is April 28th, I believe, so it's still weeks away. Any talk about that, or again, was this just speculation by the media as to how things might play out?
I think the media right now have an incentive to not give Donald Trump any credit or any, basically, they're not going to give him the benefit of any doubt because of the way that he's been treating them. But frankly, with unified party control, it's hard to imagine that there would be a government shutdown, especially over an issue that was so prevalent in the campaign. In the past, when we've had shutdowns, it's been because Democrats and Republicans haven't been able to get together and agree. I can't imagine a scenario whereby between now and April, you're going to have enough Republicans in Congress say that it's worth shutting down the government as opposed to giving Donald Trump what he wants.
So there have been also some reports about Republicans having, obviously, to face constituents back in their home districts. Obviously, we've seen it on the Democratic side here with the delegation trying to get more pressure from the progressive side of the party. What are we seeing? And, granted, you're firmly entrenched on the Democratic side, but what's your sense of what's going on in the Republican Party right now in terms of, folks who might be in cycle for 18? What's the Trump factor mean to folks on the Republican side of the aisle?
Well, it's interesting because the House and the Senate are very different. The Senate is not good news for the Democrats. The seats that the Democrats are going to be defending in 2018 are in states that generally advantage Republicans. Some of these are seats that Democrats never should have won in the first place, but they did with the Obama wave in 2012. In the House, though, it's a different story. There are 23 districts where Hillary Clinton outperformed Donald Trump, and a Republican currently holds that seat. Those districts become fair play for Democrats, and to the extent that those members of Congress support a Trump agenda or ignore their constituents, Democrats are going to be ready to make a move. And that's why some of these town hall meetings that Republicans are calling off across the country are vital, especially for these Democrats that are now in what we might consider swing districts, as well as the Republicans who could be defeated in them.
And let's go back to the recent election, and obviously the pollsters and prognosticators and the lack of folks predicting the Trump victory. What does that say for the next election cycle when sort of polling and pollsters was sort of turned on its head? What's the thought in D.C. that is, can anything go, and or really the scientific methods that were used previously, do they hold true, or is this just such an aberration that, again, folks weren't able to put their finger on the pulse until it actually happened?
Well, there are two different dynamics going on. I don't think polling is dead. In fact, I think that, from one election cycle to the next, pollsters learn from their mistakes. And one of the things that we saw this time around was that Donald Trump was able to mobilize a group of people who we would ordinarily not think were very likely to vote. We also probably saw social desirability bias work in a way that we're not accustomed to. So traditionally, pollsters have accounted for the fact that people might be less inclined to vote for a female candidate than they'll tell a pollster. They might be less inclined to vote for an African American than they'll tell the pollster because they don't want to perceive themselves, they don't want to be perceived as being sexist or racist. What we very well may have seen this time around was people saying they were not voting for Donald Trump when they actually were, because they didn't want to be perceived as a Trump supporter. And so I think there are going to be advances in polling where we kind of screen for these kinds of things and gauge the likelihood that respondents' responses to these polling questions really tap into what they're actually going to do. The other thing to keep in mind is in most House races, there's maybe one poll leading up to an election.
Yes.
The rest of the polls are sort of internal to the campaign. So I think 2018 is not going to be a situation where polling and pollsters either live or die on their predictions.
So do you think that, again, so as you said, that they'll learn from the most recent cycle and change accordingly? So the prospect for huge surprises might not be the same as what we saw last in the presidential election.
I think that's right. And on top of that, something else that I would note is that the people that voted this time around, who might not ordinarily have voted, are now part of a voter file that indicates that they voted. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is that it changes the electorate, it changes the demographics, it changes what people are going to be looking for when they compile a sample of voters. And so separate and apart from the fact that pollsters are going to be more careful, the base that they're going to be dealing with looks different now too, because it takes into account who actually turned out in 2016.
So as always, love picking your brain and that inside the beltway perspective. What are you keeping an eye on sort of in the next week coming out of the Trump administration? Whether it's something we talked about or before we touch base again next week. What are you keeping an eye on coming out of this administration in the next few days?
I think the next few days are really going to be about lying or telling the truth. Washington Post story just came out that Donald Trump has been caught lying literally every single day since his inauguration. And that's not the kind of headline that you want, especially when you're trying to push forward nominees and new policies. But when you have called the media an enemy, it creates incentives for those kinds of stories to be written. And so my bet is that over the course of the next few days, this war on the media and the media's response to it will continue to be something that's worth looking at, especially because this president needs the media to convey to the American people what it is that he's doing. And I wouldn't be surprised if he sort of tries to step back a little in his attacks.
Maybe see some less tweeting. We'll see.
I don't know if we're ever going to see that, but maybe a little bit less harsh rhetoric.
A little less harsh rhetoric. Well, it's always it's great to be able to pick your brain, Jennifer, on what's taking place down there. So appreciate your weekly Skype in. Again, Jennifer Lawless, the director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, professor of government, former congressional candidate here in Rhode Island, gives us the take as to what it's like down in D.C. and what the implications here are in the state. So Jennifer, thank you for Skyping in, and we'll catch up with you next week.
Thanks.
Okay.
See you next week.